Hello and welcome back once again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of S.A.L.T. Now, before we begin, we want you to know that this is an activity carried out by the students of Oriental Theological Seminary, in particular, the students of Masters of Divinity second year and Master of Arts in Clinical Counseling first years. This is a part of our current course requirement, and therefore, kindly note that this video is strictly for educational and awareness purposes. In this episode of S.A.L.T, we will be discussing something that touches and impacts every human life. All of us, at some point in our lives, we will go through the pain of losing our loved ones. And that, as we know, has a way of tearing us apart from people whom we hold near and dear to us. And as the great evangelist Dr. Billy Graham would say, it is in times such as this when we feel as though no one has suffered as we have. The truth is, no two people grieve the same way. The process or the journey through grief for every one of us is something that is deeply personal and unique to us. And yet, the weight of sorrow and pain that comes as a result is something that every human heart knows. This evening, as we begin this conversation, we want you to know that we are not here with easy answers, nor do we have any quick fix or solutions, but rather we are here to listen to one another, to think together and try to understand one of the most painful and difficult experiences known to humanity. So joining me today, we have two friends in our midst. First of all, we have Mr. M.Div-2. He is a student at Oriental Theological Seminary, currently pursuing his Masters of Divinity in the second year. And joining him is his classmate, Miss L. They have done their studies on the said subject, and they will be sharing their insights and knowledge with us today. And so we hope that this conversation will be a very meaningful one. Thank you, both of you, for joining this conversation. Now, before we begin this conversation, I think it will be very helpful for all of us, if we have a good understanding of the issue here. So let me start by asking the first question to the two of you. Can you help us in understanding what actually is grief, what does grief really looks like? And if you can you also explain some of the causes of grief?
Okay, grief is a natural response to a loss. And here when we talk about a loss, it's not only about the loss of a loved one, but it can be of different situation and it can be in different form. And there are so many sources of loss in life, and some are more difficult than the others. Grief is a multidimensional emotion encountered when we suffer a great loss. It may be in form of losing of a loved one, separation or divorce, retirement from our job, and end of relationship, or chronic physical illness, which lead to losing of our healthy own self. And it is an act of experience that show up in one's behavior, emotions, thinking, physiology, interpersonal, relational, and spirituality. And grief may help individuals to overcome and help them to adapt, heal, and find a new meaning after a significant loss.
Thank you, Dean. I think it was especially helpful to know that grief does not come in the context of losing a loved one alone, but like you have mentioned, sometimes it could be just the breaking away of relationships, a failing health condition, and even retirement. I mean, that was unexpected, but I guess you learn new things every day, right? Anyway, moving on. Both of you in your papers, you have touched on, the different stages of grief. The one that was proposed by Kubler-Ross, and I think that was very interesting. So, would you like to walk us through, the different stages of grief, as you have mentioned. Yeah.
So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she was also the first pioneer in near-death studies, and in one of her book called "On Death and Dying," she described the 5 stages of grief, and she mentions when a person experiences death of a loved one, the person go through the first stage of denial, and where the person is unable to accept the fact that the loss is real, and followed by anger, and it may direct to many multiple sources, including people who could not save the life of the loved one, and even anger at God, questioning why it has to happen, and even to himself or herself. And the third is bargaining. You may imagine reaching to an agreement so that you don't have to deal with the lost, or in the other sense, in attempting to regain control over the lost. And depression, it is also a tough stage where intense sadness covers the person. However, it is also a sign that you are processing things. And the lastly is acceptance. Eventually, most people accept the truth about the lost and find a way to move forward and embrace the life of the deceased loved ones, and by accepting the truth that they are gone.
Right. Thank you, Sanab, for explaining that so well. I think what you have shared also helps us to see and understanding how complex the process of grief can be. I just want to seek further clarifications from what you have shared. I'm just curious because you talked about the 5 stages of grief, as in like denial, and then there's anger, and what was that? Bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? And so my question is, if when a person goes through the process of grief, is it necessary that person would go through these 5 stages of grief, in that order? So that's the first question. And also, do you think that when a person is grieving, is it also possible that the person can arrive to the last stage, that is acceptance, without going through one or maybe some of the stages that are prior to that? So, any thoughts on that?
Okay, so here, everyone who are experiencing grief or who are going through grief do not necessarily go accordingly or in same order, in same type, but they cope up with loss in different way and in different form, and different people they used to cope up with the differences in a different way. According, it differs from person to person. The stages of grief are presented sequentially, but it is not. Grief is not linear, or it is an predictable experiences. So some people might go through the first 4 stages when the loss, when the deaths are untimely or sudden or traumatic. But there are some people who grieve without going through the first 4 stages and just accept the reality of the lost one.
So basically what you're saying is that there is no fixed formula or pattern when it comes to grieving, right? Yeah, I think that makes sense. As we've been saying, the journey through grief is something that looks different for every one of us. Anyway, thank you for clearing that up. Moving on to the next question. Right, we see that different people, they cope with grief differently. So, for instance, someone, we see that someone, when he has suffered a loss, that person maybe he has a hard time accepting that loss, and he struggles through the process of grief. And on the other hand, we have this person, who has also suffered through a similar kind of loss, and yet we see that he is able to cope with grief easier. And so, why is that so? Are there any factors that influences us in the way we experience and we respond to grief?
Well, yes, everyone faces loss at some stage of their lives, but the way they grieve may differ depending on the type of loss they experience. Someone might grieve more deeply than the other, like you have mentioned. And for an instance, when a loved one, for a person, when a loved one dies, in the case of sudden death or accidents, that is without warning and preparation, that can lead the person to go through the stage of denial, anger, or bargaining, and so on forth, or otherwise, maybe the whole stage of grief. And on the other hand, let's take an example of a family where the grandmom is sick for a long time, and they have time to spend times with the person, grieving with the person, by forgiving each other or expressing the love toward each other. All these things can be a way for them to prepare before the actual loss, and and may not necessarily go through the stage of denial, anger, and so on forth. And I think this also helps them in the days where the loved ones dies, and they are able to cope with the grieving process as well. So there are many examples and many factors why some people cope up with grief so easily, and some find difficult to cope up with it. And one of the another factor would be religious factor. When we see in the Christian perspective, we find that we find hope in the belief about afterlife, and that gives a sense of assurance and peace about the dismiss of our loved ones. And so such biblical truths are really comforting at the same time. However, for the non-believers, they don't get such privilege, and they eventually find hard to cope up with the grieving process as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sunap, for pointing some of those key factors out and explaining how those can make a difference in the way we respond to grief. And yet, regardless of whether we are able to deal with grief better than others or not, I think it does not make it any easier. Grief is always a painful experience, and we know that it can affect the whole person, whether it be psychologically, emotionally, physically, and even it may affect our relationship with God also. So, can you help us see how a person who is grieving, how those aspects can be affected as he goes through the pain of loss?
Okay, everyone go through grief in one point of our life, in one way or the other, but it affects us in a different way or in different form. And some may feel numbness in the body, denial, and some may have intense crying, and sometimes a period of disbelief also. Some people will have physical effects such as shortness of breath, indigestion, exhaustion, and weakness, and even loss of appetite. And some might have emotional effects, which they might have a feeling of inner emptiness, anger, guilt, or have nightmare. And some might also have social effects, which the grieving person often tend to withdraw themselves from the others, and tend to withdraw from social tensions. And some might have also even spiritual effect, such as questioning God, why let it happen to me, the loss, and a question about His nature and sovereignty. And some have unhealthy effects, which lead to them to unwilling to talk about the deceased person, and they will have developed that unwillingness to describe or when somebody talk about the deceased name or situation, and which lead them to open or subtle weak and self-destruction.
Yeah, just listening to that long list of effects itself is so exhausting, and we really have to feel for people who are going through something like that. And when we realize, the many different ways grief can affect a person, it also reminds us how important it is to respond with care. The problem is that a lot of the times, when we know of a person, say a friend, um, who is grieving, and we want to help them, but we are at a loss. We really don't know how to go and comfort them. And so, do you have any suggestions for us? How we can go and walk alongside people who are grieving?
Okay, for me personally, some of the ways in which we can respond to them, to those who are experiencing grief, and where we can comfort them, is like the best gift will be the gift of prayer, support, encourage, and affirm, and by being there for them. Sometimes, while we're helping them or supporting them, we also need to remember that being silent is also truly a golden, and we need to be very careful of what we say. And sometimes it's good for us to stay silent and to give assurance that they are not alone and that we are there for them. To respect their privacy by maintaining boundaries and listening to them with empathy and with an understanding heart, and not a heart with questions to their emotions or thoughts.
Definitely. Um, like you mentioned, we need not necessarily be someone who is very good with words when we try to comfort people. As you have said, just going and offering a listening ear, or sometimes our quiet company, that can offer a lot of comfort to someone who is grieving. And also, yeah, I think it's important that we try to respect the boundaries. Sometimes we can mm, be so private about what that person is going through, and then that might end up irritating that person also. And yeah, I think what you have shared, those are very practical steps, and I think all of us, we can um, try to use those as we try to help people who are grieving. Maybe we will touch on one last aspect before we wrap up this conversation. As you have said, grief is a normal response that everyone goes through when we suffer loss, and yet you know there are times when grief can also become complicated, such that it becomes unhealthy for the person. And so, can you tell us some of the ways through which we can prevent grief from reaching that, from grief becoming complicated?
Yes, it is very important to understand that grief is a very natural response, and it is a process of learning of the loss. And uh, we live in a society where we often hear men should not cry, or men don't cry, or say crying is for the babies, or some people think that such words are comforting for the one who is grieving, and even further saying that it's God's will, just move on. I mean, such words, it really disrupts the process of grieving. I should say that, and not allowing them to grieve properly can eventually lead to a complicated grief, and it can also prolong for years and years. And so it's really important to let it out and not repressing the emotions. And sometimes it can be really difficult for the person to process in the way they grieve. and that's not healthy at all. And some of the preventive measures that I would suggest would be using of such words that I mentioned earlier. So using such words that I mentioned earlier can really affect the one who is grieving and can make them feel ashamed of the grief. And it's better it's better to affirm that expressing emotions is quite normal, and crying and tears are signs of love and the bond that they have with the one who was dismissed, and it's not a weakness. And the Bible also reminds us where Jesus even wept and he grieved on the death of Lazarus. Apart from that, there are many cases when it comes to complicated grief. Some of the things that I would suggest is consulting with a professional therapist, where they are guided and provided available guidance and support, and connecting with others who have had some experience can enable the person to grieve properly. And I think the one of the most important mechanism to cope up with the complicated grief is also self-care as well. And I think that's how I end.
Right. I think I totally agree with you. The usage of words. Sometimes, out of our enthusiasm to comfort someone, we don't really think through what we want to say, and we end up hurting that person instead of helping him. And so, just being very careful of the words that we use. And like you said, we must allow that person to grieve, however he or she wants. So, yes, thank you for sharing those insights with us. Well, we will wrap up our conversation in a few minutes, but before we do that, is there anything, any words of comfort that you would like to share to people who might be going through grief, even as we're speaking now?
I just want to say this to you, and it's from my heart. And if there is out there anyone grieving at this moment, sometimes it can feel really heavy, and at times you may feel like you're carrying it all alone. But please remember that you're not alone, and your pain matters, your tears matters, and the life of your loved ones still matters. Healing is not forgetting, but it means learning to carry their memories in a way that gives you strength for tomorrow. And therefore, take one small step at a time, and give yourself the permission to take rest, to breathe, and to hope again.
Grief may be experienced differently by different people. Don't compare yourself with someone else. It may take time for you to heal, but know that healing will take place eventually. And don't be too hard on yourself. Your grief may not make sense to you right now, but it will someday. It will make you stronger, and you will be able to handle things in a more matured way in the future. And remember, it is always good to open up to people whom you trust. And above all, remember God is there to guide you and protect you.
Okay. Thank you both, for sharing those words from your heart. Maybe just a few words from my side as well, for anyone out there who might be carrying the weight of grief in your heart. We know that the pain that you are carrying, it can be overwhelming. And sometimes people may not really understand why you're grieving the way you are grieving. But if there's one thing that we are taking away from this conversation, it is that, the journey through grief, it's different for everyone. And so it's okay to feel that way. At the same time, I also want you to know that you are not alone. When you have your friends, you have your family members who care for you. We might not be able to take away the pain that you're going through, but we are willing to walk alongside you if you will let us. And above all, I hope that you will remember that God is always near you, even if it may not feel that way sometimes. He is always near you, and He will give you the strength to take this one day at a time. Well, thank you once again, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. We will see you soon again. Until then, take care, and may God's peace go with all of you.